Hello and welcome to Rise the Victor. My name's Chris Mead, your host, and...
I'm back again. I got invited back from the first episode. Yes. Wow, I've obviously done something good. Hi, I'm Lindsay. I'm Chris's wife.
So what are we talking about today?
What are we talking about, Chris?
Yeah.
We're going to talk about trauma. What is trauma?
Right. Okay. So
over to you.
I have to do this in a quite methodical way because as I keep getting pointed out my wife, I get very technical and very quick when I'm explaining this because I have to tell this on a frequent daily basis from clients. So trauma is when we experience an event or a situation where there's perceived threat or danger to us and there's an attachment and meaning to the outcome of that event. So, you may have heard that you're told that you're only born with two fears, a fear of falling and a fear of loud noises. Well, in fact, there are other unconditional threats which you're actually conditioned for as well. And those threats are called unconditional threats, which stimulate a response whenever, I will come back to that word again, the amygdala, and the part of the brain which is responsible for fight or flight, your gatekeeper, your protector. Okay, whenever your amygdala recognises any of these unconditional threats, then it will provide a response in some way to protect you, to make you aware of whatever that perceived threat. And just some of those unconditional threats are being abandoned. Now, obviously, as a baby, if your mother is not around you and you feel abandoned, then naturally you cannot survive without your mother looking after you, caring for you. And abandonment can be when we feel that we're not being cared for, looked after, and many people experience abandonment in their childhoods from partners, parents leaving relationships, from people finding someone in their life is suddenly gone. So abandonment is one of the most powerful unconditional threats. Of course, then there's the threat of being killed, which is clearly going to be a strong response. Somatic pains, having pain inflicted upon us. Heights, the fear of heights. Suffocation. Now, suffocation is an interesting one because some of the responses we may have when the amygdala responds, we may have shortness of breath and hyperventilate, and that can feel that sense of fear, suffocation, that you can't catch your breath. Okay, so often people can fear that they're going to stop breathing or not be able to breathe properly. So suffocation is often triggered when people hyperventilate. And then we have being trapped. Now, being trapped is really common when we think about social anxiety, where we may be in a social situation. Maybe we're doing a presentation at work, whether or not we're in a social gathering, and we don't feel comfortable and we want to make an escape. And your amygdala will fire off a response, depending on the severity, to make you want to escape, to get out of there. Then we have...
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
Sorry, if anyone's just been listening to what Chris has been saying and it started to cause any little symptoms or anything that's starting to go inside, because I know listening to some of those, if you're suffering from anxiety or panic or trauma yourself, and what Chris has just said might start to trigger off a few symptoms, can you just give them something quickly to just run through, to just sort of distance themselves so it's detached?
Look, the thing is that when we think about something, when someone's conversing with you or you're listening to something, you have to go inside your head and find meaning as to what that person is saying. And consequently, if that meaning has attachment of a fear or an anxiety, then it can trigger off responses. And that's why on chrismeadenonline.com website there are exercises you can do which can desensitize you if you feel triggered in any way, as I talk about these subjects.
Okay, so they can go on there and if go through some little top tips and exercises,
some techniques which will ground you to increase your levels of serotonin.
Just get yourself feeling calmer. You can breathe, relax, calm. everything's okay. All right, cool.
Yeah, so we have being trapped, we have open spaces. Now, open spaces is often, we can be maybe feeling exposed and vulnerable. And then we have predators, they can be air-based and ground-based. And that's more primitive things. But and then we can have threats, actually, which we've learned through epigenetics. Now, epigenetics, what does that mean? Well, your parents can learn fears which are passed on through your DNA so that you can experience those fears as well. So
Thank you.
Pretty cool, isn't it, really?
Sharing is caring.
Depending on what those fears are. But effectively, whenever we look at any of the conditions we have for anxiety or PTSD or panic attacks, we can always pretty much drill it back to one of these unconditional threats in some way. The threat that your amygdala is always in the background, assessing your environment for any risk, any danger to you, and cross-examining to those unconditional threats, but then also the learned experiences you accumulate in your lifetime.
So our amygdala is a really good thing, isn't it, for us? Keeps us safe.
Absolutely.
So we want to make friends with our amygdala.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And often I think the amygdala is... people talk about fight or flight, and
it's so much more than that.
Such a huge generalisation. It does so much. It's a repository for every learnt experience which is perceived threatening or dangerous to you. Now, that doesn't have to be life-threatening. It can be a sense of humiliation, embarrassment. It can be situations which have occurred. And from the point of learning, that experience is always looking out for you. Now, where the amygdala falls short is it doesn't know the difference between whether or not you're remembering a past experience, experiencing something in real time now through your senses, okay, or whether or not you're catastrophizing a future possible outcome of a situation. Whatever you bring into your mind, your amygdala will process it as if it's happening now. So it's important to think about that, because our amygdala can fire off a response like, hey, pay attention, there's a perceived threat, a danger, and you might get a whoosh of adrenaline in your body. But then it's your thinking which then amplifies the response, because what happens is often we attach a meaning to a sensation we have in our body to a potential outcome, a disaster, having a panic attack or having some embarrassment or humiliation or fearing some negative outcome. And your brain, your amygdala, processes that catastrophe and then fires off a stronger response. So there's very much attachment where your amygdala is in the background assessing your environment for risks and dangers to you based on those unconditional threats, but also the learned experiences you accumulate over your lifetime. And as soon as it sees a pattern of similarity to one of those learned experiences, it will say, hey, pay attention. There's a potential threat or risk to you. And then you get a physical response in your body, maybe an emotional response. And then it's from that point how we attach meaning to that response. It can then escalate it out of control if we're not careful. So
you had a client, I think, who was in the London bombings, is that right?
Yeah.
You went through, obviously, horrendous time, and from that moment was triggered and was getting panic attacks when in going on tubes or there was lots of crowds of people. There was lots of things that from that trauma he was going through. Or was it she? Sorry, I can't remember.
Yeah, she was actually one of the station managers of one of the underground stations actually affected by it.
Yeah.
And she had PTSD as a result of it. And ultimately she had a huge responsibility because of responsible for one of the larger underground stations at the time. And what happens is that when we encode trauma, the brain encodes the context of where you are, whatever the activity you're doing, and whatever the perceived threat or danger is. So in the case of the bombings, obviously there was a lot of panic. There's a lot of people running around and really fearful. So there's people experiencing fear. And consequently, that triggered fear in the individual, understandably. But then that fear gets attached to the environment. So whether or not you're on a tube, whether or not you're, going down an escalator or stairs. Now, your amygdala takes your 5 senses, so visually, auditory, sounds, gustatory, smell, taste, and
olfactory.
And olfactory, okay. So see here, smell, taste, and
kinesthetic. Touch. That's it.
Yeah. So the thing is that you can experience the heat, which is quite interesting. A lot of times, when people have panic attacks, they fear getting hot, and then that triggers because it's a sense which is encoded at a point of in trauma, like the smell. So in the underground, there's certain smells and certain aspects of the environment which are very specific for being underground. So you can be triggered by any one of your 5 senses.
They could be listening to a certain track or something. So
if you're listening to music at the time of a traumatizing event, that music is co-encoded with that experience. And every time it's like, I'm sure if you imagine, just you're in the car and you got the radio on and a song pops on. I remember a great time with a friend, a boyfriend, your girlfriend or whatever. Or I remember that person I hated. We have a memory. It jogs a memory, and the association we have in that memory to a place, a time, an individual or situation. And it's the same for an amygdala-based encoded memory. It's the situation where it's encoded, and then from the point of that encoding, your body, that memory can be re-triggered based on experiencing a pattern of similarity. So the problem is the brain does one of 3 things. It does deletion, distortion, and generalization of information. So what can happen is that your brain will look for generalizing certain information. So this is where, for example, the fear of going on public transport, if you have a panic attack on a tube, and say, for instance, the London tubes, okay, often they're crammed, they're very busy, and they can be very hot, and sometimes the trains stop between stations. Now, if you feel trapped at that moment and feel like you an escalation of anxiety and have a panic attack, then straight away that in memory is encoded. But part of that memory was movement. So the movement of the train is encoded with that experience. So, and being claustrophobic, maybe the temperature, feeling uneasy because the adrenaline starts to flow in your body. So as a result, your brain encodes that trauma. So what do? We start using coping mechanisms like I'll take a bottle of water with me, or I'll avoid using the tube. I'll try and use the overground services instead. And then what happens is that encoded memory can then also get triggered by being on a bus, because the bus, there's movement and there's busyness. So likewise, it can be a tube. Or a tube is a tube. An airplane is a tube, with wings on. So your brain generalizes these transport mechanisms to an association of a past experience. So consequently, it starts in one thing, then it generalizes to another, then another, and then another, and then we start to do avoidance. So very much when people have anxiety, the easiest course of action is avoiding a situation, a circumstance, and then if we're left untreated, it becomes more and more of an issue, and more things become trigger points. So consequently, you become more withdrawn, more inwardly focused, and less engaging in the outside world with life, and that's really where your amygdala is overprotecting you.
Yep. Absolutely.
But, the thing is that we are all, to a certain extent, throughout our lives, are going to be traumatised by different events, situations, relationship breakdowns, family issues, bereavements. We all will experience some level of trauma. I
think the word trauma, a lot of people think of it to be something that has to be really massive.
Yeah, often people think, it's got to be a really life-changing moment, bombing or some terrorist attack, or some a fatality. No, it doesn't. It can, and the thing is, the more we have in society now, is we're being triggered more because we're, as human beings, far more stressed out, We have often worse diet now than we've had before, so that has factors in our we just want a big chemistry set, and our levels of cortisol and adrenaline are defined by what we eat and what we express, what we expose
I just
ourselves.
had a sort of image in my mind here. We're one big chemistry set. Just imagining us all being actually see-through. We can all see inside the workings in our brain and all those chemicals.
Yeah, it'd be nice to, if you think about the those sand timers, and you've got the different layers of colours of sand. So, okay, this
Used to get those at the Isle of Wight.
That's right. Yeah. So, because ultimately, our chemical makeup is made up by the experiences we have, but also our thoughts. If you think about thoughts, okay, a thought can elicit a happy memory, a negative memory. We can think to the future and have aspiration and desire and excitement and motivation, but also at the same time we can create sadness, trepidation, whatever. And with every one of those emotions is a different chemical makeup inside your body. So it's very much understanding that we are a big chemistry set, and our thoughts define our chemical makeup, and we want to stack in our favour to be more resilient, more healthy, more happy.
Yeah, because knowing how to change your own chemistry rather than just reaching out for medication, synthetics, and that doing it for you, you can actually do it yourself. It's knowing how to do it. And that's massive.
Yeah. And the problem when someone's traumatised and it gets the doctors and gets some antidepressants, the worst of it is that when someone starts the medication, often the symptoms of the person that's experiencing become significantly worse before getting better. So typically it can take a month for these drugs to kick in, but before those drugs kick in properly, the symptoms of the whole reason of why you've gone to the doctors get amplified and often can show up in panic attacks and all kinds of things. So what that does to the individual, it makes them form a belief that they're worse than what they were. But because it's the drugs which is stimulating those responses. So that's why some people will go on them and go, oh my God, they're horrible, and they don't want to take them, and because it was just horrible side effects. But there's some people who will persevere and go for it, but then they find themselves on these drugs for years because they're too afraid to come off of them because of how they were just as they went on to it. So, it is a bit of a double-edged sword, because ultimately you're forming a belief of how you're reacting, responding based on a chemically induced response until such times as the drug kicks in and starts to do what it's supposed to do.
Okay. So going back to your explaining about trauma. So you've gone through the unconditional threats.
Yeah. So effectively, you're from a point of traumatization, the landscape of your brain becomes more vulnerable for future encoding of trauma. So consequently,
that explains why some people say, why does it always happen to me? Why does this keep happening?
Well, I'm sure if you think about, like, there's times where something happens to, maybe to two people at the same time. Yeah, one person just gets up and gets on with life and doesn't seem to be impacted, and the other person's like struggling. Yeah. So like, why is that happening to me? Why is that? Why am I having all this stuff? And it's very much about the conditioning that each individual has had. So your environment which you're brought up in, we have different factors in terms of, did you be brought up in a stable family environment? Was there love and attention? Was different aspects of, can there be cultural pressures? There can be so many different factors which determine whether or not someone is going to be vulnerable in their life to trauma. So what I've found is that when I'm working with clients, every client for me feels in a personal history. So they put their age in, and I see everything which has happened, gone on, because that gives me an insight as to what the workings of the amygdala is and why it's accumulated the responses.
So you're like a detective, a mind detective.
Yeah, really. And from the information of all the different events, and often people don't remember everything, that's okay, but I can get a good idea as to what's going on. We are able to recognise, what are the trigger points and why a person is being triggered again by something. Take, for example, an abusive relationship. So if a person's been in an abusive relationship, when it's been verbally or mentally abusive, or worse still, sexually abusive, if that relationship comes to an end and the person finds himself in a normal, caring relationship with someone, if that person who is caring in a new partner, new caring relationship, displays any of the traits or the behaviours of the person who was abusive in the past relationship, then your amygdala will recognise that and potentially trigger off a reaction or overreaction to whatever that behaviour may be. And it can be an extreme response, and to the person who's completely innocent in a relationship will be like, whoa, hang on a minute, what's happened here? This is way over the top response. But because the person's been conditioned because of the past learned experiences in previous relationships, your amygdala doesn't differentiate between the two. As soon as a person displays any behaviour which is similar to that past person innocently, the amygdala will trigger it. So hey, it's just like that time. Yeah, so this is really why clearing the events of the past is so important, because we're effectively ripping out those learned experiences out of your book of learning so that your amygdala isn't overreacting, over-responding.
Could somebody say, what happens if you sort of change my brain chemistry, if you remove those memories, I'm not protected anymore?
Yeah, and look, the thing is that your amygdala will always protect you. You can't switch it off. But if you think about your life, if you didn't experience fear is good. Okay, fear keeps you alive. If you didn't have fear, you'd walk in front of a bus. Or you do something where you didn't realise. Okay, so fear is an important response which we have to keep us safe, to protect us. Now, the response, it means that, we can remove the association of a fear, because you still learned from the experience, because cognitively, the experience is encoded in the prefrontal lobe. You have the understanding of this behaviour or this situation was wrong, or for whatever the situation was. But what we're able to do is remove the negative associated emotional, physical responses to the event of how that person or how the situation came about. So there's no longer the emotional charge, the physical response, whatever, but you'll still protect yourself going forward. Because it's not about deleting or erasing a memory so you never knew it happened. You still want to have that and that insight. So, for example, if someone's been raped, then they want to be sure that they protect themselves and they don't place themselves in a situation, however that came about. You wouldn't want to remove it and then not know and then repeat the same thing. It's recognising that you understand what happened, you take your insight, the wisdom from that learning, that experience, but you're no longer experiencing the negative associated emotional, physical responses. And that's an important thing, because ultimately we can hold on to stuff which has happened many, many years ago, which then impacts our life in a current day. And of course, it can impact how we interact with other people, whether or not we open up to people, whether or not we show our emotions, whether or not we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. All of these things are all conditioned about our experiences of the past. Some people, as a defensive mechanism, will shut off their emotions because they're too afraid of getting hurt again, and that's an understandable response. But then obviously from that, they're living a life with less of a richer experience. I mean,
the topic, this is so interesting. I wish this sort of thing we'd learnt this at school.
Oh, yeah.
We just never get taught these things when we're younger, and I think we've got 3-year-old twins, and I really want them to have a better understanding of how their mind works and what happens to them, to have a more understanding of their emotions and feelings and their reactions and responses to things. And I think we're in a fortunate position, or they're in a position where obviously both you and I have learnt a lot about how the brain works, neuroscience, and how we can change and take responsibility for ourselves. So anyway, I've forgotten the point I was getting to.
I think it's interesting when I'm working with people is that we're often not very in tune with our emotions and the different types of emotions we experience. So part of the process of when working with someone is you start to become more aware of the emotions of what is triggering. Effectively, we clear all negative associated emotions of guilt or shame or blame, sadness, hurt, frustration, whatever it may be. But often, lots of times, people aren't necessarily identifying those initially unless it's pointed out to them. But as you go through it, it's like anything, you learn it and then you understand, okay, I'm experiencing that because of this. And you can start to, almost, it is a bit like a magnifying glass on your emotions and on your life, and a bit like Sherlock Holmes, you're looking for those clues, but then they start to show up and you start to recognise just how you're acting, responding, and as a result of traumatisation which happened in previous experiences in the past. So, traumatisation, from a point of traumatisation, changes your beliefs, your behaviours, your responses to your environment and situations. So the more traumatised you become, the more impact it's going to have on your life. But it's not to say it can't change, because, that's ultimately what we do, is we are able to reverse those associations so that you can go out and live your life free from those.
Absolutely.
Emotions.
Gosh, yes. I think so many people could do with that right now.
And we will go into each different anxiety, social anxiety, general anxiety disorders, and all the different aspects about what is uniquely to those. They all cross over actually quite significantly. It's the same process we're doing, it's just slightly different context.
Cool. Okay. Do you want to wrap that up?
Yeah. So if you have any questions or
definitely
any
suggestions
for future episodes, then you can email us on podcast@chrismeaden.com, or you can go to chrismeadenonline.com and you can post questions there and information. Also, there's resources there to deal with various things and access to online courses which we have. So and do share these episodes if they're maybe helpful for others, and we will
lots more coming up. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Thanks, Chris.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.